Good morning and welcome to In Focus with me, Silvana Pavlovska, Melbourne, Australia. You may recall a few days ago we broadcast two parts of an academic paper from Dr. Maroš Meličarek, who is from the Faculty of Arts at the Department of History in Slovakia. The paper is titled Foreign Powers and the Macedonian Question at the End of the 19th Century. So we did those parts on the 9th of May, and today we're going to do the final part 3 of that academic paper, which we have selected especially for your information and education. And it goes like this. A new stage in the development of the Macedonian question was the decision of young intellectuals from Macedonia. Damian Gruev, who was born in 1871 and lived until 1906. Goce Delchev, who was born in 1872 and died in 1903. And Ivan Hadji Nikolov lived from 1861 up until 1934 to establish a secret revolutionary organization to fight for the liberation of Macedonia from Ottoman domination. This happened in Thessaloniki, or Solun, as is its proper name, on the 23rd of October, 1893. And in addition to the aforementioned personalities, Christo Tatarchev, who was born in 1869 and died in 1952, Andon Dimitrov, 1867 to 1933, Petar Pop-Arsov, 1868 to 1941, Christo Batangiev, 1868 to 1913, also took part in the founding. The ideology of the movement was developed by Georgy Petrov Nikolov, 1865 to 1921, a teacher from the Bulgarian grammar school in Thessaloniki or Solun. At the second formal meeting on the 9th of February, 1894, the main theme was to determine the basic ideas of the organization, and thus, the organization will be fundamentally revolutionary and will remain secret. 2, revolutionary activities will take place within Macedonia. 3, regardless of faith and nationality, any Macedonian can become a member. Other goals were ratified at the so-called the First Revolutionary Congress in the town of Resen in August 1893. So the next bit we have on this page is it says the destruction of the Ottoman social system. And then we've got, that was 1, 2, to remain an independent organization. 3, to seek the basis for Macedonian autonomy. The name of the organization was established only after the Rila Congress in 1905 as the Internal Macedonian Andrionopol Revolutionary Organization, later as VMRO, with the main support among the population loyal to the Bulgarian Exarchate, although leaders announced an effort to involve other dissatisfied elements within the Ottoman Empire. At this point, it is important to point out the national orientation of the organization. The correspondence of Goce Delchev clearly points to the Bulgarian orientation. As it mentioned, we are Bulgarians. George Petrov said in 1896 that the Macedonian population consists of Bulgarians, Turks, Albanians, Rumuns, Jews, and Roma. Just remind ourselves that this is the academic paper from Dr. Maroš Meličarek from the Department of History in Slovakia and published by the Serbian Studies Research Volume 11, number 1 in 2020. The course of events ran into a spiral that was already very difficult to stop. The constant fighting between VMRO units and the Ottoman army units with Baji Buzuks gradually took on a more global dimension. In January 1903, a secret VMRO Congress was held in Solun, at which, despite the delegates' reservations, was agreed that an uprising would begin by the end of the spring of the year. According to the text signed on the 17th of January 1903, was the motivation for the beginning of the uprising. And we quote, "The current situation in the country, the exceptional conditions created for this organization after the uprising declared by the committee, the danger of a new uprising, devastation and demoralization, predisposition and interest demonstrated by European diplomacy, I beg your pardon, in our case." It should be added, however, that this decision was not taken unanimously by the VMRO leadership. For example, personalities such as Delchev, Petrov, and Santansky rejected it. Since the main driving force of the uprising was to be the peasant population and it had work around its farms in the spring, the beginning of the uprising was postponed after the harvest, that is the 2nd of August, as start for approved, let's have a look at the next page now, for approved by the Secret Congress, for approval, it should say, by the Secret Congress of the Bitola Vilayet in Smilevo. During the spring of 1903, the situation in Macedonia became increasingly unclear, tense, and violent. These were the terrorist actions of the Djemidjis, says the author of this academic paper, such as sinking of the French ship Guadalquivir in the port of Thessaloniki or Solun on April 29, 1903, bombings of railways, cafes, a gas storage facility, an Ottoman bank, a post office, and a German school. Even in this case, Macedonian and Bulgarian historians still have various perspectives where to place the Djemidjis. Although they became members of the Macedonian pantheon of heroes, they used to identify themselves as Bulgarians, as well as the groups found as Svetoslav Merjanov, 1876 to 1901. The events in Thessaloniki or Solun activated the European powers, and a special note was addressed calling for the appointment of a special inspector general with the power of attorney for the Macedonian region, that is Solun, Skopje, and Bitola, and the establishment of joint police units under the command of foreign officers. However, the politics of the great powers recorded the opposite result. Inspector General Hussein Hilmi Pasha, 1855 to 1922, used his competencies to pacify municipalities supporting VMRO or other resistance groups. Troops were sent to the most troubled areas. Repression began against the Christian population by the Muslims in Solun itself. Atrocity moved to the Bitola area also, where 11 Christians were assassinated. The Ottoman army attacked the village of Sapari, and the situation culminated in the assassination of Goce Delchev in Banica. On July the 28th, General Staff elected by Congress in Smilevo, Gruev, Sarafov, and Lozanchev decided that the uprising would begin on August 2nd, asking not only the people of Macedonia to join. In a memorandum to the great powers, Macedonian leaders declared the failure of the Ottoman administration to implement functioning reforms. With the proclaimed goal, the goal of the uprising is not to defeat the Ottomans, but to prove that they will not defeat us. We will fight the partisan war with terrorist and anarchist actions. The uprising began on the evening of August 2nd in the Bitola Violet, which remained a key center throughout the fighting. We speak about the Ilinden uprising, Ilindensko Vostanie. The insurgents began with attacks on the property of Muslim Beys, destroying telephone and telegraph connections, blowing up bridges, administrative buildings, and attacking local military garrisons. According to Vermeer or sources, between 29th of July and 19th of November 1903, 26,408 fighters were involved in the action. On August the 3rd, the insurgents managed to occupy the mountain town of Kruševo, which lies at an altitude of 1,350 meters, that's 1,350 meters above sea level, and under the leadership of Nikola Karev, the so-called Republic of Kruševo. Macedonska Republika was proclaimed. A flag with the slogan "Freedom or Death" was hung over town. The administration of the so-called temporary government of the city was run jointly by Bulgarians, says the author, Greeks and Vlachs. On August the 12th, insurgent units, unprepared to face Ottoman superiority, many fighters were only 16 to 17 years old, were defeated at the Battle of Silva by more than 20,000 Ottoman army led by Bakhtiar Pasha. Kruševo was pacified and burnt, and a 10-day episode of Macedonian statehood ended. On August the 19th, an uprising broke out in the Edirne region of Thrace, and since it happened according to the Orthodox calendar on the day of the Transfiguration of the Lord, it is called the Ilinden Preobraženie uprising, Ilindensko Preobražensko Vostanie. The fate of the uprising depended on Bulgaria, but mainly on the attitude of the great powers. Russia and later other powers were clearly against the Bulgarian intervention. After the fall of Danev's government, General Risto Petrov, 1861 to 1941, became prime minister, who was also a member of the Brotherhood and personally had sympathy for active involvement. Due to the attitude of the powers and unpreparedness of the Bulgarian army, his intervention was limited to diplomatic démarches addressed to the powers. This was practically a decisive moment because other nationalities could not be involved in the uprising, despite the fiery calls made by Vermeer officials. In the case of the Turks and the Albanians, this makes sense, despite assurances that the uprising is not religious. Members of the Greek and Serbian Orthodox Church have not joined. Russian, British, and American consuls and ambassadors announced to their governments that the Ilinden uprising was a Bulgarian affair. I'll read this again. Russian, British, and American consuls and ambassadors announced to their governments that the Ilinden uprising was a Bulgarian affair. Ottoman officials called the uprising a Bulgarian conspiracy. Frederick Moore, the only European journalist who managed to get to Kruševo shortly after the suppression of the uprising, described the city's population as a Romanian with a Bulgarian colony. Also, the records of Nicola Kirov-Maisky, 1880 to 1962, mentioned Romanians, Bulgarians, and Greeks, not ethnic Macedonians. And this fact is undermining Macedonian character of this lie, perhaps, or deception, should read. Not ethnic Macedonians, and this fact is undermining Macedonian character of the whole uprising to a large extent, says the author. I shall mention him again, looking at his name, Maroš Miličarek from Slovakia, an academic. His paper is titled Foreign Powers and the Macedonian Question at the End of the 19th Century. Yes, so we'll just go through this again. Ottoman officials called the uprising as Bulgarian conspiracy. Frederick Moore, the only European journalist who managed to get to Kruševo shortly after the suppression of the uprising, described the city's population as a Romanian with the Bulgarian colony. Also, the records of Nicola Kirov-Maisky mentioned Romanians, Bulgarians, and Greeks, not ethnic Macedonians, and this fact is undermining Macedonian character of the whole uprising to a large extent, says the author. The suppression of the uprising resulted in 4,694 victims, almost 4,700 victims from the civilian population, and at least 30,000 people fled to Bulgaria, or the territory of what is Bulgaria. After suppressing the uprising, Russia and Austro-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, presented a new reform program in October 1903, according to which the Inspector General for Macedonia was to have a Russian and Austrian deputy, and the Turkish gendarmerie was to be commanded by Christian general and foreign officers. The situation in Macedonia turned during the visit of King Edward VII of England in June 1908 in the Russian Empire, where a preliminary agreement was reached between the English and Russian monarchs on special status for Macedonia. I'm going to read this again. So it says, the situation in Macedonia turned during the visit of King Edward VII of England in June 1908 to the Russian Empire, where a preliminary agreement was reached between the English and Russian monarchs on special status for Macedonia. So you've got the King Edward VII from England and the Russian monarchs, they're not named here, having a meeting in June 1908 and deciding the future or the fate or the status for Macedonia and the Macedonian people. Here in brackets, we've got Sir Charles Hardinge, 1858 to 1944, ambassador to St. Petersburg, and Count Alexander Izvolsky, 1856 to 1919, were also present at this meeting between King Edward VII of England and unnamed Russian monarchs on June 1908. The territory was to be subordinated to a governor appointed by the great powers of this, effectively excluded from the administration of central power in Istanbul. The possibility of entrusting all power to Hilmi Pasha instead of incompetent officials was also discussed at this meeting between King Edward VII of England and unnamed Russian monarchs in Russia in June 1908. The Anglo-Russian conspiracy, the author, whose name is, I have to look it up again, it's a bit hard to remember, Dr. Maroš Miličarek, in his academic paper, puts in quotation conspiracy, the word conspiracy. So he says the Anglo-Russian conspiracy, as this meeting was called, so they did refer to the meeting as a Anglo-Russian conspiracy for the division of the Ottoman Empire, became a red cloth for the young Turkish Committee of Unity and Progress, which took virtually full power by rejecting any interference by European powers in the empire's internal affairs and prepared its own proposal for solution of Macedonian question. So we've got another party involved, not just King Edward VII from England and the unnamed or unknown undisclosed Russian monarchs at this meeting in June 1908, where there were two other representatives from Ambassador to St. Petersburg and Count Alexander Izvolsky. Well, we now have this other party entering the scene, namely the so-called Young Turkish Committee of Unity and Progress, which took virtually full power by rejecting any interference by the European powers in the empire's internal affairs and prepared its own proposal for solution of the Macedonian question. Goodness. The Young Turkish Revolution was also supported by some part of VMRO, but despite the possibility of consolidating the state from within, other events meant a significant weakening of the empire from the outside. When it says empire, it's referring to the Ottoman Empire or the Turkish Empire, which, by the way, was in Macedonia for 550 years. Subsequent developments during the Balkan Wars and the outbreak of the First World War need to be analyzed separately, since the Macedonian question became one of the key problems among Balkan powers. That is a statement that I've just read to you from the author. That's his final sentence. I'll repeat again. He says that subsequent developments during the Balkan Wars and the outbreak of the First World War need to be analyzed separately, since Macedonian question, he says, became one of the key problems among Balkan powers. A problem, he says. Problem for which they had no solution, of course. As we know, the subsequent events that took place. So that was part 3 and the final part of the academic paper titled Foreign Powers and the Macedonian Question at the End of the 19th Century by Dr. Maroš Maličarek. He is from Šafarik University, Košice, Faculty of Arts, Department of History, Slovakia, and it was published by the Serbian Studies Research Volume 11, number 1, in the year of 2020. If you are interested in any of these papers, by all means, you're welcome to check them out. They're on the academia.com website. And I, as a member of the academia.com portal or website, have the good fortune of accessing academic papers which I am able to share with you for the sole purpose of expanding your knowledge about events based on research from various authors about the Macedonian question, the so-called Macedonian question, or initially termed by the Greeks or the Greek politicians as the Macedonian struggle. Later on, it was referred to as the Macedonian question. And as we've just heard, this author of this academic paper says that it was a key problem. The Macedonian question was a key problem among the Balkan powers. The Balkan powers, they refer to them. I can tell you there are no Balkan powers. There are countries that reside in the Balkan or the Macedonian peninsula, in addition to Macedonia, and they are Albania, Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia. Very well. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.